What came next? Shortly after 1979, shortly after the Iranian Revolution, Saddam Hussein and Khomeini got into what is sometimes called the First Gulf War, although in the United States, the First Gulf War sometimes is used to refer to George Bush's war in 1991. Saddam Hussein and Khomeini, Iran and Iraq had this enormously useless war that went on for many, many years. The Iraqis bombed Tehran. Khomeini sent children, youngsters, young teenagers to the front to be killed. It went on until 1988. And shortly after Saddam Hussein and Khomeini stopped fighting, Saddam invaded Kuwait and took over the place. And the United States organized a response in January of 1991. Shortly after 1979, with the Egyptian peace treaty, Anwar Sadat was assassinated. In fact, he was assassinated in October of 1981 at a celebration, a military parade celebrating the great victory of 1973 of the Yom Kippur War, or the Ramadan War, as it's sometimes called. The Iranians probably were behind funding a group that was much more radical than the Amal militias. The Amal were the Lebanese Shia militia of the 1970s. The Iranians probably were behind the rise of Hezbollah, and even if they weren't behind them, certainly the Hezbollah was inspired by Iran. Many people associate suicide bombings of French and American soldiers, Marines and French soldiers, in 1982 and 1983 with the formation of the Hezbollah. I always like to mention Hezbollah is a term that's mentioned in the Quran. Earlier, I had mentioned Jafar or Ghaffar al-Numeri, who had supported Anwar Sadat, but moved towards Islamism in Sudan and imposed the Sharia in 1983. Sudan would become, in the 1980s and 1990s, a base for Al-Qaeda. Sudan would become a place that had involved genocide in their western regions and a long civil war in their southern regions. Hamas was organized in 1988. The PLO was largely secular. Even if individuals were religious, they believed in the armed struggle against the Israelis. They had a modus operandi that was something like the terror groups in Europe or the Irish Republican Army and so on. Hamas had a very specific Islamic discourse about what the fighting was all about, quoting Sharia or misquoting Sharia, in my humble opinion, in order to justify it. And finally, in the 1980s and 1990s, the Saudis upped the ante with the dawah, the calling of people to embrace Islam, supporting mosques around the world, training leaders, and intensifying the Islamic nature of Islam all around the world, and the religious nature more along the lines of Saudi religiosity. One has to assume that the Saudis were responding to the Iranian Revolution, and together they transformed Islam around the world. What happened in 1989 to 1998? The fall of the Soviet Union occurred in a fairly short period of time. There was a program called Glasnost, openness. But by the end, in 1991, the Soviet Union basically just ceased to exist. They declared themselves irrelevant and devolved power, as it were, to a commonwealth of independent states, the republics of the former Soviet Union. After Saddam invaded Kuwait in 1990, George W. Bush, the first President Bush, put together a coalition of the willing to liberate Kuwait from Saddam. Bush, I think, was very wise to say, you break it, you bought it with Iraq. He did not go after Saddam in Iraq. His son, George H.W. Bush in the first Gulf War, his son, George W. Bush, did go after Iraq. And what history will tell whether the Iraqi situation after 2003 was an unmitigated mess and disaster, or it was a mess and disaster which eventually had some positive ramifications. 1990 and 1991, that process also brought about the Madrid Conference, in which, to a certain extent, the Israelis recognized the PLO, and to a certain extent, the Palestinians of the PLO recognized Israel. There was also a behind-the-scenes process starting in 1991, which we generally give the term Oslo process. We call the Oslo process. That reached fruition with a handshake on the White House lawn in 1993. This was a period in which, however, there was an awful lot of Islamic extremism. And by the end of the decade of the 1990s, Al-Qaeda united a number of jihadi groups in a so-called war against America. So you had not only the Iranians saying, Magbar America, death to America, but Al-Qaeda declaring that a war against America and declaring that any Americans were basically licit to kill, that this would be a defensive posture. Many of you know what happened in 2001, September of 2001. 4 planes were hijacked and wound up targeting the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon, and a 4th plane crashed due to the action of the people on the plane, but presumably was targeted for the White House or the Congress. I put 1998 on the PowerPoint and did not correct it, but bin Laden had been writing fatwas even a little bit earlier than 1998. What about the 21st century? Well, I mentioned 2001. I mentioned George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq in 2003. The Arab Spring occurred starting really in December of 2010 with an engineer setting himself on fire with gasoline, basically because a government officer had confiscated his peddling stand and he couldn't make a living. And we also have proxy wars getting hotter and hotter after the 2011, during the past decade. The Syrian Civil War, the rise and possibly fall of the so-called Islamic State. By the way, ISIS stands for Islamic State in Iraq, and in Asham, we often translate this Syria, but it really is the Levant. President Obama liked to call it ISIL. Sham is an Arabic term, which is quite broader, more broad than just the modern day state of Syria. So some final thoughts. I think 1979, the year 1400 in the Hijri calendar, had precursors. The stage had been set, but is an important turning point in modern history in the Islamic world in the Middle East. And the events of that year, 1979, peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, the attack on the mosque, the turn to be more conservative among the Saudis, the creation of a jihadi force, and that's what they called themselves, Mujahideen, by Osama bin Laden, the Iranian Islamic Revolution, the downfall of the Shah with his westernizing approach, and his approach that liberalized social realities, especially for women in Iran. All of those things set the stage for the history that has transpired in the past 40 years. When we talk about Islamism or political Islam, we're referring to a worldwide ascendancy of much more aggressive religious activity. that is associated with a notion to have political rule and very often with extremist and with anti-Western movements. I don't think that the Sunni Shia and the Islamist Salafi considerations have totally replaced secular nationalist and socialist pan-Arab and pan-Islamic endeavors. But these have come to dominate our everyday consciousness about the fighting and the controversies that are going on in the Middle East. In the past few years, they've been more complicated by notions of Turkish recovery of the Ottoman greatness associated with Recep Tayyip Erdogan's AKP, Adalet ve Kalküliyet Partisi, the Party of Justice and Development, also a religious party that started out being perceived as a moderate Islamist party, but now most people think of it as being a very strong and very extreme, or I should say extreme. They're not as extreme as some of the Islamic State groups, for example. The Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty remains in force and has inspired the Lebanese who had a treaty in 1982, but it was basically shot down by the Syrians and the Jordanians, and in the past year or just about a year, the so-called Abraham Accords. I mentioned Saudi Arabia embarking in a much more conservative direction. One could say that the invasion of Afghanistan and the Mujahideen's repulsion into Afghanistan was somewhat like Vietnam, except that the United States survived Vietnam and the Soviet Union really did not survive Afghanistan. I don't know that that is the single most important reason that the Soviet Union ceased to exist, but some scholars seem to say that. The Iranian Revolution had a response by Saddam, and I think that Saddam's response put in motion not one, not two, but three Gulf Wars. The Gulf War between Iraq and Iran, and the Gulf Wars which involved the United States. 1979, the year of the 14th centennial of Islam, changed the Middle East. Events in and around this year played a role in creating a more religious environment, jump-starting Sunni extremism and political Islam, introducing the Islamic Republic, which imposed religious law and reversed many reforms and women's privileges, as well as supported Shia-related movements. 1979 also introduced a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. It is cold, but still holds. 1979, I think, introduced a 40-year period of change, which totally dramatically remade Middle Eastern history.